Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Laura Creed, and I am the co-chair of the Shaker Heights chapter of the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland. Thank you all for being here tonight. Before I introduce our moderator tonight, we have a lot of public officials and former public officials. So if you are in the audience, could you please stand and introduce yourself?
She's looking right at
I'm looking at Judge Turner.
Judge Turner McCall from Cleveland Municipal Court.
David Weiss, Shaker Heights Mayor.
J.J. Costello, Judge, Lethality Municipal Court.
Sandy Walker, I'm former Eastern Municipal Court Judge, currently acting judge in Shaker.
Bert Griffin, former common pleas judge.
Richard Trojanski, former Maple Heights City Council President.
Nancy Moore, City Council, Shaker Heights.
Well, welcome everyone. So it's my pleasure to introduce Rachel Dissell. As many of you are aware, she is a reporter with the Plain Dealer for a number of years. I should say award-winning investigative reporter with the Plain Dealer. She's written on a variety of topics that we'll talk about tonight, but specifically sexual assault. Recently, lead paint seems to be a big area that she's been working on. I know she might mention some legislation that passed yesterday. She's also written about the juvenile justice system, among others. So without further ado, please help me welcome our moderator, Rachel Dissell.
Thank you so much. I will not talk about lead poisoning tonight, or maybe ever again. No, of course I will. So I feel like there's so many distinguished folks in the audience tonight, and I have some questions that I'd love to ask these panelists. I know that you guys will probably have some questions and topics you want to bring up as well, so feel free to pass your questions forward, right? I think the goal is to make tonight as interactive as possible, and also one of the things that we've discussed is that as we talk about various areas of expertise, we're all going to keep in mind incorporating into our answers what people can do in their daily lives and their voting lives and their politically active lives to work on this topic over time. So we're still waiting. Oh, come on up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just kind of very briefly introduce themselves. Anyone up here probably could talk for about an hour and a half about their experience, especially in this topic area. But we'll do quick introductions, and then we'll get into some questions that I have for you guys so that we can walk through where we are at on this topic. And are you guys sharing that mic, I think? Okay. How about we go this way, let Representative Boyd get her stuff out. Put her sunglasses away.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm Megen Gergen. I work for the Domestic Violence and Child Advocacy Center. Very briefly, I have been an advocate in various courts throughout Cuyahoga County for a little over 10 years. So.
And good evening, I'm KJ Montgomery, judge of Shaker Court for 26 years, prosecutor before that for after 1978, and currently the chair of the Cuyahoga County Domestic Violence Task Force. And I know we're going to talk about a lot of the topics, but right now we are gathering folks from just about every arena, including some of the people at our table, to get consensus and ideas to keep moving forward.
My name is Alexandria Ruden. I'm an attorney with the Legal Aid Society. I've been there since 1984. Before that, I was an attorney at the Free Medical Clinic of Greater Cleveland. I became a lawyer when the domestic violence law passed. So I have been working in this area since 1979. And still doing it. And I'm old.
I'm grateful she's still doing it. Hey, everybody. Thank you for your patience. I have another job. I do federal policy part-time for a nonprofit. So I'm a child advocate, children with special needs and mental health disorders as well. So I came from that and then, of course, ran into the car accident on Lee Road. So my name is Janine Boyd. I have the privilege of serving you all here in House District 9, the best district in the state of Ohio. Yes. So this is my third term. I've done a lot of policy work. As I said, I've been doing policy work at a nonprofit since 2005. So I've done a lot of work around children in crisis, families in crisis, and children who witness violence. And so my body of policy work is also reflective of that. And I'm not an attorney. I have an MS in speech and language pathology. I'm a speech and language pathologist by trade, bilingual speech and language pathologist. And I grew up in politics, and then so my mom told me all the time, you probably will run, and I said, no, I won't. And she said, yes, you will, and no, I won't. And she said, well, you'll either get bit by the bug or, you'll get ticked off. And I did. I got ticked off, and so then I ran. And so here I am. And thank you for having me. And I have Aishas Law. Then you all are very familiar with the story. I don't have to get into detail about that right now, but it has really been a work of, it's really taught me a lot. And I've been working on it since within a few weeks of her brutal demise. So happy to discuss it today.
We will definitely talk about that. And so just kind of to set the table a little bit, conversations about domestic violence often happen in the aftermath of a tragedy or, a personal or public thing that happens that we all have to grapple with. And that's tough, but it also does spark conversation and often can spark action. We also know that year-round, all the time, when everybody isn't discussing it, there's work going on in the trenches. And by the trenches, I mean the courtrooms and at the legislature and in private conversations with advocates who provide support to people at the moments when they need it most. And so I think that's why it's amazing that we have folks here that do that work all the time, because they're not reading off a sheet. They know this work so well. And so I wanted to kind of start off with Alex, because I know as a reporter, did I call you Alex? I should have called you Alexandria.
No.
Okay.
Either one.
As a reporter, whenever I try to learn about something, I always try to get a grasp of the history first. You have to know where you're coming from to figure out where you're going. So I was wondering if you could share just a little bit with us about, when you first got into this work, where we were at and what progress has been made in the last 20 or 30 years, so we can kind of have that joint understanding when we start the rest of our conversation.
Thank you. I'm going to start with where we were in the 1500s.
Oh, that's longer back than I thought.
Wait. A Christian scholar propagated rules of marriage and said, when you see your wife commit an offense, don't rush at her with insults. Scold her sharply, bully and terrify her. And if that doesn't work, pick up a stick and beat her soundly. For it is better to punish the body and correct the soul than to damage the soul and spare the body. Then readily beat her, not in rage, but out of charity for her soul, so the beating redounds to your merit and her good. This was the same type of attitude we bring in to America when we had the rule of thumb. And then we began to say, this is not good. So we said we're not going to outright abuse, but then we did something probably worse. And that was, we closed the curtains, we shut out the public gaze, and we allowed the parties to forgive and forget without any intervention by the law. And this is where we moved. This is what was going on in the 1800s and early 1900s. And it wasn't until 1962 that a California court said, following a wife beating, there's no peace and security left in the home to be preserved. So through 1970, there was nothing in the lexicon. There was nothing. Nobody could talk about domestic violence. It didn't exist. And then I will give credit to legal aid. In 1974, they entered into a consent decree with the city of Cleveland. And they had argued that victims of violence couldn't go to court and bring criminal cases because, they're really in collusion with their batterer. And then the consent decree said they would look at each case on its merits. And then we move into 1975. And then Attorney General William Brown convened a task force. And it was a task force to see if domestic violence was epidemic in this state. And there were lawyers, there were doctors, there were other professionals, police officers. And the decision was, yes, it's epidemic. And unfortunately, it wasn't just epidemic here, it was epidemic throughout the country. And David Hartley in 1979 enacted the first domestic violence law. What was very difficult was until then, police, judges, all professionals treated domestic violence, they treated stranger abuse much more seriously than domestic violence, mostly because they didn't understand the dynamics that victims go back, that without resources they definitely go back, that sometimes going back keeps them safer. So this was a major cultural shift. And we began that. And the first thing the law did was make domestic violence a crime. No longer was it to be behind closed doors. And now we have both a civil and a criminal component to the law. And it's relatively, it's 40 years old, but really, on balance, it's still new. And you're getting the research is coming in, you have the experts, they're becoming more valuable to speak about some of these issues. And we've moved forward. We have domestic violence as a factor in custody decisions. We never had that till the 90s. We have a stalking statute. We have the Violence Against Women Act that's helped our shelters. It's also ordered that policies would be mandated by police on preferred arrest as the preferred course of action in this state. We didn't have that before. We have something that says police have to do mandatory police reports. So they're documenting the history of domestic violence for that victim's future. And I'm sure I can go on, but I think I'll stop. We have done remarkably well. Can we do better? Absolutely. But we have moved this state in a very positive direction.
So that is in the legal world, that progress is lightning speed, really. 40 years is pretty fast. And so building on that, with all of those things that happened, Judge Montgomery, if you could talk a little bit about what this work looks like on a daily basis, what you see from the bench, and kind of what knowledge that's come from the laws, the research, and what tools that you have now that you might not have had when you started doing work around these cases.
Well, I think one of the first things you realize is this is a crime that knows no economic constraints, no ethnicity, no neighborhood. It comes from all 5 of our communities that come into the Shaker Court, whether they be the most affluent or the most poor. One thing it does seem to know is a little bit about age. The people who come into court tend to be of a certain younger age or else very elderly, and this panel can certainly give their opinion, but part of me believes that the system works to a certain point, and then either the parties straighten out the situation, the victim is able to escape or empower him or herself, or they shut that door again, and we never hear from them. One of the things that we realized, for example, in my first trial as a prosecutor of a domestic violence case in the early 80s, is education is still required, and we try to educate in our courtroom. I lost my first domestic violence case that I ever tried because it was a threat of violence, and although we were not supposed to hear this, the bailiff walked into the jury room and heard the foreperson say, which we're not allowed to hear, "I don't care if he didn't catch her and cut her, it's not domestic violence." So this was 1980. So we in the courtroom, with the luck of our advocates, are trying to tell people that the courts are a safe place to come with the tools that our advocates can give them, with the education that we can provide to empower victims, let them know that they are not alone, that the court is there for them. Marzi's Law has just passed in the last year, and that has put a new burden.
Can you tell folks a little bit about what that is in case they don't know?
Sure, although Janine might be better. Hold on.
Sure. But I mean, well, I'll talk about.
I'm talking about like a super brief description.
Marcy's Law was a constitutional amendment that gave crime victims extra rights. Rights to be notified of hearings, rights to be able to participate in court, rights not to have intrusive discovery. The implementing language has not been adopted yet, but it is about to be introduced.
And it added time to murder convictions, so it went to 18 instead of stopping at 12. My bill goes a little bit further than that for domestic violence and instant murder. We can talk about that.
Yeah, we will totally get there. Megen, so we're talking about legal strides and education and awareness, but a lot when we think about domestic violence, we think about public perception, and I think public perception has changed in some ways from what it was in the past, but it seems like there's still stigma that remains. And do you see that with clients that come in, and can you talk a little bit about that, how that has changed and maybe how it's not changed enough?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's still that stigma of, well, why is she staying? You know, she tried to go to court and she went back. And I think it's a little different in that there's kind of that blame in that, well, she chose to be in this relationship. She chose this partner, and so there's still that, well, what did she do to make him hit her, make him do whatever? I think that there has been an increase in conversations, but it's still uncomfortable for folks. It's still uncomfortable for people to want to intervene, or there's still that, if I see an incident on the street, is it safe to intervene? If I call the police, what's going to happen? If I, tell, and so I think we're starting. I think it's still kind of in the baby steps, but I think we're starting, and I think it's just giving folks the language. Judge Montgomery, we're talking about education. I agree wholeheartedly, right? It's, what does this look like? And then from my perspective, it's, what do you deserve, right? How do you empower someone? Yeah, empowerment and education are so huge, not only for victims, but for you all, right? And you're taking that step by being here and educating yourselves, and I think that's really a big part.
And also, I think there's like the big DV, when we all see a video of a football player harming someone, we look at that and we go, okay, that's what that is. But when we hear something in a personal situation, or with someone we know, or someone in our neighborhood, or someone in our workplace, we might not be as quick to point something out and call it what it is.
And we also know the visible. Once we see the injuries, we know that's DV. But again, there's threats, there's coercive control, and frankly, the visible is only a very small part of the dynamic of domestic violence.
And that includes isolationism, hugely.
And I would add too, when you're talking about the football player, we don't know them, so it's a lot easier to judge someone, or why would they do that when we don't have that personal connection? When it's our neighbor or that guy at work that we really like, well, he couldn't have been arrested. Something else must have happened. When we have that personal connection, it's a lot harder to see that bad thing in someone that we care about, right?
Yes. So Representative Boyd, I feel like, especially as a reporter, I always see some of the best chance for change and for policy change and for action when something happens that captures the public attention. I wish it wasn't that way, but I do like it when the media gets beyond this is what happened to how can we do better, or what are some solutions to this, and also when legislators do that as well. So maybe this is a good time to talk a little bit about Aishas Law, how discussions about what changes we can make come up, and then also just the tough parts of those conversations. What can we do with the law? What can we legislate? And also, what happens when we write the best, most beautiful law ever on paper, and there's not the will to implement and enforce it? And that's a lot of questions I just threw out there. So we'll take them, we'll kind of dissect them a little bit at a time.
Great.
First, you can kind of give us a primer on,
Sure.
on how it came about.
Sure. So, as I mentioned earlier, within just a few weeks of Aisha Frazier's brutal demise, I met with her uncle, George Frazier. He had a mutual connection, connected us, and he had in her eulogy and in her in remarks he made at her funeral, begun to advocate for a law that would include the implementation of a lethality screening tool. And a lethality screening tool is simply that. It is a short questionnaire that law enforcement can administer to a victim upon responding to a domestic violence, intimate partner violence call. And based on the responses by the victim, determine how dangerous, how lethal that family situation is, and move from there. So that's where the bill begins. And I met with Mr. Frazier several times, and he has been a great help to the process. He's brought a great many advocates, survivors, and family and friends of Aisha to the table to help advocate for the bill. And Alexandria and I go way back, and I am fortunate enough that I could tap into her expanded knowledge and start working right away. I had also, my Aunt Sandy is in the audience, and she is a former judge, and she is a close family friend. That's why I call her aunt. And she herself has lost someone to intimate partner violence. So I had, even earlier than that, met with her long before Aisha's murder. So I was starting to develop legislation. I was doing something with Rep. Nikki Antonio, previously from Lakewood, now Senator Nikki Antonio, a Domestic Violence Victim Protection Act, and we worked with former Judge Sandra Walker and others around that legislation. And then when this happened and I met with Mr. Frazier, there was an opportunity to really look at the body of laws that exist in Ohio in terms of victim protection and determine where the gaps are and modernize those laws and fill those gaps. So what Aishas Law aims to do is create a continuum. So I mentioned I come from behavioral health. So my child advocacy work, we do everything from medically fragile foster care to workforce development for the harder to employ. And what I've learned in the behavioral health HHS environment is when there are continuums of care, right, it's harder for people to fall in the cracks, right? It's harder to lose them. If we can engage them at one point and keep them engaged throughout the continuum, then you have a better chance of really effectively helping them in whatever area they're needing help. So the goal was to sort of replicate that in policy around victim protection. So point A, law enforcement, lethality screening administered. Based on those responses from the victim, a referral is automatically made to domestic violence victims programs in the region or county or community. Or in the bill, we make permissive the creation of a high-risk team if domestic violence victim programs are not available, immediate, accessible in that community. We got a lot of small towns in Ohio, a lot of villages, a lot of small communities. So they may not have the resources that we might have up here, for instance. And then from that point, we also looked at something has to change at the level of the court. There's a lot of pleading down of violent charges. There's a lot of dismissal of cases. And what happens, the research all shows that when that happens, typically the violence escalates after that court engagement. So if you have continuous court engagements and the perpetrator continues to return home, the violence escalates. And so we know that we have to do something at the engagement of the court as well. So that's the general gist. There are details. I don't know how detailed you'd like me to get at this point.
I think it's interesting too because often a lot of what I would call aftermath laws focus so much on penalties, like as if we just penalize someone more, that will stop the crime from happening, even though a lot of research tells us that's not the case. You know, punishment doesn't really help save a life all of the time, you know. But putting prevention things in place, and how difficult is it to kind of discuss and envision requiring preventative things, like a lethality assessment, or like, because I know that there's a lot of things, I mean, and Alex can talk about this, there's a lot of things in place right now. It's very hard to get courts and police departments to comply with the things that are already in place. So how are you thinking about that? I'm sure you've discussed it ad nauseum with people.
I will keep discussing it. It's vital. So first of all, law enforcement is very supportive of this bill. And let me also say that this bill has gotten a lot of bipartisan support. And the discussion prior to me answering the question regarding knowing someone, you know, knowing the people involved. Aisha's abuser was a former state lawmaker. And I served with people who served with him. And as soon as they found out, they signed on to this bill because they were shocked. And they felt, in part, in a small way, responsible because they didn't see it. So that does make a difference. Law enforcement has been one of the most supportive groups around the bill because, in part, domestic violence calls are among the most lethal for law enforcement. There's some insane percentage of officers who've been killed in the line of duty in response to domestic violence calls. They know the people, it's a revolving door. And in fact, the co-chair of the Criminal Justice Committee that my bill is in, who's a big supporter of the bill, called his judge just to ask, you know, how many domestic violence cases have you seen this month? And the judge said something about near 80. And he said, how many did you dismiss? He said 69, 79 of them. And he said, so he agrees. Something has to change at the level of the court. And the lethality screening, once we know how dangerous the situation is, that provides the law enforcement to really better understand the situation and respond in the future if they have to be additional responses. It really prepares them to respond, I think, more effectively and in a safer way.
And understand the danger to themselves. So
you wanted Alexandria to say something?
Yeah, go ahead, weigh in.
I think that Aisha's Law on balance is really going to move the needle. Again, I don't know how many of you know those lethality assessments, but they are to document the most high-risk domestic violence victims based on, have they been strangled? Is he obsessive? Does he have access to weapons, or she? Based on some of those things, that perpetrator is more highly lethal. So part of that lethality assessment is explaining and sharing with the victim so that victim may know the risks they're in. But it also will educate, just by doing it, law enforcement. And hopefully, the law enforcement will talk to the prosecutors, and everybody in that system makes it work. We do it already in civil court as well, in domestic relations court. We need to know how lethal our perpetrators are. So this bill is going to do wonders for that educational piece. And again, I know you didn't mention it, but the thing that we're most excited about is there is a piece in there on strangulation. Finally, working with strangulation and making it a crime and calling it what it is. It's not attempted murder, it's not attempted assault, it is near fatal strangulation. Because understand, with strangulation, it takes 3 seconds to unconsciousness and 4 minutes to death. So that is part of the bill as well.
So just a little bit more information. The lethality assessments came out of research. I mean, like, heads up, the researchers, they're awesome. You know, folks who talked and interviewed and looked at reports and really combed them for these details that led to certain outcomes. to put them together for that. And for a long time, researchers in intimate partner violence have been talking about how strangulation is such a precursor for more violence. But it was hard for people to catch on and think about codifying that. Also, I think that lethality assessments or danger assessments, there's a lot of different names for them, are a relatively new thing. I think they in a way, and I might be wrong about this, so if I am, correct me, also grew out of what advocates had been doing for a long time with their clients, with domestic violence survivors, which was talking through with them their situation so they could make a safety plan. So I think that a lot of these questions were not originally, how should the police react, but let's talk about your experience to see how we can make a plan to keep you safe. And so could you just talk a little bit about that, because I think it's still such a vital thing and it's not discussed often, that how important this is and why hearing it from the person involved is really important.
Yeah, and to touch back too on the lethality assessment and law enforcement, in districts 1 and 5 in Cleveland, all of the officers are administering the DALE, the Danger Assessment Law Enforcement, when they arrive to a domestic violence scene. That's a grant initiative that we've been working on with the county, probation, a list of people if I'm going to forget. But also, the plan is to expand it into the entire city of Cleveland by the end of the year, and then we are working on a proposal to then expand it to the suburbs. And so that is something that our agency has really been working on, because it is something we do. So anytime, I shouldn't say any, most of the time I meet with a client, I'm doing that danger assessment. And like Alexandria said, right, it's, have you been strangled? Does your partner have access to weapons? And it's not just me sitting and, is this yes, no, right? If someone says, yes, I've been strangled, it's that continuing conversation. Okay, tell me more about that. Like, how often is this occurring? Have you blacked out? And then at the end, a lot of times, if it's high risk, excuse me, I'm gonna be saying, hey, there are some things here that I'm concerned about, right? I'm afraid for your safety. I'm afraid based on the answers to some of these questions. I should also say that before I do a danger assessment, I kind of prepare that victim or that client, that survivor, and say, I'm going to ask you some questions that might seem a little bit odd. They might be a little bit intrusive, because I also want to give them the opportunity to not answer or to just say no thank you. But asking those questions, and it's exactly that. It's that safety plan and helping them have that conversation. Because sometimes one part of the danger assessment that we do as advocates, sometimes, not all the time, it kind of depends on our availability or how many hearings, is we'll get out a calendar and say, okay, this incident happened on this day, this incident happened on this day. And giving folks the opportunity to see that, and actually, well, it only happens every once in a while. It's not that big of a deal. Saying, no, this is happening quite frequently. How can I help you be safe? And then kind of from there, really tailoring that safety plan to what are you going to do today? What are you going to do tomorrow? All right, courts again next week. How are you going to handle this? All right. And again, just facilitating that is so important. Yeah.
And so a point on what you said about some of these programs being implemented, expanding, could go to the suburbs. Part of what we're supposed to talk about tonight is what people can do in their own lives. And when you see these things being discussed in your city, at city council, for folks that want to be elected, if you want to be a public official, asking someone's position on this, how are you going to do this? Are you going to put the money towards this? I mean, because often you can have the most beautiful looking program in the world on paper, like the high risk team. But if you don't have the funding to pay the detectives and the probation officers to do the work, and you have a very small number of people doing hundreds and hundreds of cases that are very difficult, their work isn't going to be as good. So I think often when you see political races and stuff like that, you have to say, how is money going to be allocated? And I'm just going to say this from personal experience, and maybe someone can disagree with me. I often find that when the issue that's being discussed has something to do with gender-based violence, there are a lot of reasons that the money is not available. Many other priorities, lots of priorities. And so I think as a community member and a voter, you can say, make it very clear, this is a priority for me, and this is how I make decisions. That's one way you can have your voice heard.
And if I could just interject some good news. For the first time ever in this state budget, so you should know, not only do I have bipartisan support on the bill, the kinds of conversations I've been able to have with the governor and the governor's office and his criminal criminal law folks. They've been really extensive, and they are very supportive of the bill. And we were able to get in the budget for the very first time, it's the first time ever we've ever had a line item for domestic violence victim programs across the state of Ohio. It's $1 million each year. We've never had that. We've never had a line item. So I wanted to say this earlier, that stigma that, it exists across genders, and it exists in in the State House, in the Senate. If you're watching it all, I'm sure you could come up with examples of how you see the stigma. But there is, we still have a loophole for marital rape on the books, and we tried to submit an amendment to get rid of that, and they voted down. So I'm trying not to get political, I apologize. It's my life. But this is, we are still fighting, right? We are still fighting attitudes about women, people who would allow themselves to be victims. If you're a guy, why don't you fight back? If you're a woman, why don't you leave? So we're still dealing with that. So I wanted to bring that up as well.
Awesome, and we have so many questions coming in. I have one more of my own questions, and then I'm gonna go to the audience questions. Alexandria, you have told me personally a number of times over the years when I am fired up and have gotten angry about something that wasn't done correctly or should have been stopped and wasn't. You have prefaced what you say that no law, no policy, no piece of paper will ever save every victim from being hurt or killed. You say that because you know it's true, and you've had it happen, and you've had clients of yours that have been killed. But what are the best tools that we have now? We've talked a little bit about the lethality assessments that could be used more effectively, or the things that are in place that we need to make sure that they're working the right way, that need more monitoring.
I think what she says her bill, but I think I have said, I've said this to many people. If somebody wants to kill you, they're going to do it. So I think educating our clients, our victims, and the best way to do that, good or bad, is that lethality assessment, because you educate not just the victim, but the community. It's also the resources, housing, it's transportation. I have a client now who had to leave, and I asked her why. She said, I want to make my own choices. The abuse was bad. He wouldn't let her drive. But the point I'm trying to make is she didn't have a plan. So now she's out. She has no place to live. It's hard to get, we're getting support, but it's going to take time. And I had said, maybe you want to wait until you get a plan. And she said, no. So my point is that victims and survivors need resources. They need other protections other than just the criminal piece. They need the housing, they need transportation, they need the ability to get child support, they need the ability to get spousal support so they can move on with their lives. The other piece, and I think Janine spoke to this a little, we have to make a difference for our children. And unless we do that, because domestic violence we know is intergenerational, the children of today are going to be the abusers of tomorrow. Or the victims, that's true.
That's right. Well, and one of the things that I think comes up is people say, well, if this tool is so great, then how come we aren't just using it? It costs money. You have to buy it.
Isn't that crazy? It's really expensive.
And yes, and you have to have training. One of the things that the Domestic Violence Task Force has been looking at and has loved is the fact that we have nurses, sane nurses at our table, sexual assault nurse examiners. They've come in and said that ER doctors and people who drive ambulances have failed to be trained to recognize signs of strangulation. There's a need for training. It's one of the things they're asking what we can do. Another thing that I think the judges, when we get trained, we start to do is take on that responsibility and take it away from the victim. Don't look at her. She has no authority in this case. The city found that there was a violation. They filed this charge. She did not file this charge. She cannot amend this protection order. She can't kiss and make up like you stop your divorce and go to a counselor. It's now in my hands. You've crossed that boundary. She's got nothing to do with it. She can talk, and she's allowed, but don't look at her. You want this changed, look at me. You want this dropped, not happening. So I think that and the other thing is I love our advocates because I say talk to that advocate. She's going to tell you to have a bag packed, a ready bag. She's going to tell you to have a code word so when you call your mom and you say, we want ice cream, that means 911. They have so many tools that education needs to get to, and we also know that both the county as well as our wonderful representative are working on ways to spread these lethality tools so that we can get them disseminated.
And let me just say just one more thing, and that is
more things.
what we have to do. KJ talks about, Judge Montgomery talks about strangulation. Rep Boyd talks about strangulation. Once we get a law, we do one thing: we name it, and then education comes from that. Same thing with domestic violence. It was nothing till we had a law and we named what we were talking about.
And I just wanted to also add that I was able to get money in through the Attorney General's line item for training for the screening tools for law enforcement.
And so, Judge Montgomery, you're talking about these complications in a courtroom and how you see these different aspects of this case. And we could probably, there's a lot of lawyers in the room, I can tell. We could probably get into the weeds about how evidence can come in and hearsay and all of that. I don't know that that's a direction we want to go in right now. But talk about how understanding the dynamics of domestic violence can be important. And one of the things, I spent some time, some months back in Common Pleas Court in Judge Sherry Midday's courtroom. She was very interested in starting a domestic violence docket. It looks like it may finally happen. I heard it was someone else's idea, but really it was hers. But, and she started that out by trying to learn about some of the offenders in her courtroom and what would help them comply with the rules. And I thought she took an interesting approach of, I need to know what's going on in their lives as well, so that I can let them know that if you need some help, I'll help you too, but I am going to be watching you and my people are going to be watching you. So there's dynamics on many sides of this. And so there has been a move towards specialized training, specialized courts. If the county does a court, it will be, I think, the first time they've done a docket like that. The municipal courts have a little more experience in doing that. But can we talk a little bit about that, why those dynamics are important?
Well, I think we have someone here from the Cleveland Municipal Court System who has a little bit to do with domestic violence. Judge, tell them about the specialized docket. You have to use this.
So in Cleveland, we have 4 judges who have a specialized domestic violence docket. I am one of those 4 judges. We have a high-risk docket. I told them you were late. They know. We go way back. We go way back. We go way back. We go way, way, way back. She's my sister. But Turner McCall, you guys heard that. And so there are 4 judges who have specialized dockets. Our administrative judge, Michelle Early, has a high-risk docket, and that's out of those 2 districts the advocate mentioned earlier. And so in addition to handling my normal docket every day, it's my responsibility to hear those cases of domestic violence that come through Cleveland. In addition, I don't know if you guys even realize this, in Cleveland Municipal Court, we handle the felony cases when they come in on their initial appearances. So we're the judges that set bonds for those cases as they come in and their felonies. I tend to set them pretty high. My background is the same. I actually started out as an advocate with Women Together, which goes way back long before DVCC, and Alexandria was one of my mentors back then. So I've learned about this from the ground up, and I've spent most of my career advocating for victims of domestic violence in one way or another. I'm not going to steal your show, but so our responsibility is to look at those cases. And I could just tell you very briefly that it's not as simple as telling either party what to do. I had a young lady in my courtroom today who said to me, I love him and we just need some help because it's just going to go away because, this should have never happened and, it'll be okay. And I had to have a real conversation with her in court about my responsibility for her safety. She didn't like it, but as the judge says, she has a right to talk. I'm not going to tell her she can't talk. Of course, he heard her advocating for him, but what he heard from me was no way. So he's still in jail. I actually came back from Mexico, and I'll shut up, a couple weeks ago where I helped do some training with other judges from around the country about domestic violence. And one of those judges that came up said, whatever we do, somebody's still going to kill him. My response to that was, not on my watch. And at least I will know that I've done all I can do. And then I can be at peace. So I think that's part of our responsibility as jurors, is to make sure that we're following the law and doing what's safe for the victims. But you guys can talk to me anytime.
Thank you. You can jump in whenever you want. And I think this question follows what you just said, this question from the audience, very well. You have a responsibility as a juror and as a judge, and this question is, you know, if I hear what I think is abuse going on in a nearby home, shouting, crying, and I call the police, what will happen? Conversely, is there something that I can or should do on my own? And I think that's a lot more difficult of maybe a decision for some people to make. You know, what should I do? When is that moment that I should intervene? It's probably very personal, but I'm guessing you guys have some advice on that type of situation.
So I'll start. I'm one of those people that stops for everything. I stop for the accident. I stop, I give my name and my address, and I say, call me. So part of it is education to make people understand that that call is worth making, that it could be life-changing. And if not life-changing for that mother and father, perhaps it will be life-changing for that child, since as we've all said up here, and I say to a father in front of me who's very proud of his 7-year-old daughter, you realize there's a 99% chance that this young lady is going to pick an abuser just like you, because that's what she's learned and that's how she's learned it. So when a 911 call is made, or if you make contact, or if you believe your child's playmate is in a violent situation, tell someone, tell the police, tell the school educators, let people with the proper knowledge try to intervene and help. Would you perhaps have to make a police report? It would sure be helpful if you would, just like if you saw her rear end me, you know, in my car. And she said, no, you're backing up fast. I mean, to have that statement, might you have to come to court? Sure. But one thing I think law enforcement can tell us is generally that perp is dangerous to that victim because he has control over him or her. The fact that you're the next door neighbor, you're not under that person's thumb. So I think many times in many crimes, the victims, the witnesses are not nearly in as bad a situation as the TV gangster shows show us, that now they're going to come after you. So I would hope that you would get involved. Others?
I have a tiny bit of a different take. I think that as we've moved through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and now, we have to balance victim empowerment and the system's right to take control. And that is an extremely difficult balance, because for me, if I saw abuse and saw somebody being abused, I definitely would try to intervene. That's who I am, or I would call somebody. But if there's just shouting at home, what I would worry about is, am I putting the victim at greater risk? So each time we think about which is the best way to do it, you have to think of those two things. Sometimes going to court, that victim wants it dismissed. I really love that the judges say no, but on the other hand, sometimes they know their abuser best. They also know that maybe they'll be killed if they leave. So I think that it is specific to a case, to an individual. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would add too, so in this situation, it's a neighbor. How well do you know that neighbor, right? When you're picking up your mail, hey, you know, Joe, how are things? Hey, is everything okay? It can be opening the door as simple as that, or hey, is everything all right? So-and-so is, I don't know, they seem like they had a little attitude, and you're going to know that relationship better, how you can approach that. but opening that door and what, Alex said is starting that conversation. I think that those are the things. And I would say I'm also probably likely a person that would intervene. Is that always the safest option? No. So safely intervene, even if it means after the fact, right? The next morning, the next day, at the block club party, at the, city council meeting, whatever it is. How are things? How are you? Can help.
It's good advice. Ask questions, be personal. It's good to know our neighbors. That way we know how to intervene and
By
interact.
doing it that way, you empower the victim to do it herself or himself rather than do it for them.
Just kind of saying, if you need me, I'm here.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I did witness, and this was intimate partner violence. It was a young teenage couple. They were arguing, it seemed, in the car in front of me, and I was leaving my parents. I wasn't far from my parents' home, and the person driving the car kicked the young lady out of the car while it was moving onto the tree lawn, sort of in between the street and the tree lawn. And I watched him kick her, literally got his foot up and kicked her out of the vehicle, pulled his door slammed, and drove off. So I went and got her and took her to the police station, and we talked the whole way, and she was a mess. She was not a mess at first. She was very quiet, and then I just started being open with her, and she started to fall apart. And she said, the one thing she said to me that's never left me is, I didn't think anybody would believe me. I'm so glad you saw it. So.
It is a problem. And so this question has a stat in it, and I have not fact-checked the stat, so we're going to hope that it's a good one. It says, since half of all women killed in domestic violence situations are killed with guns, can you discuss the role of guns in domestic violence situations and what we can do about it? It's a big question. We thought discussing domestic violence was enough, but now we're going to bring guns in and go at it from there.
So that was my first bill. Like I mentioned, I was working on it with now Senator Nikki Antonio. It was the Domestic Violence Victim Protection Act, and it simply said that when there were domestic violence charges, temporary restraining order issued, even before a conviction, we could, if the victim or somehow law enforcement was made aware that there were firearms in the possession of the perpetrator, the law enforcement could retrieve those firearms, and the court could determine what the next steps were for, and it's a temporary, so, the fact of the matter is the majority of the state Senate and House and the governor's office are all more pro-gun and less not. So the way we wrote the bill was it was a temporary relinquishment of the firearms, and the court, with input from victims' advocates, the victim, him or herself, and the court, as well as law enforcement, the parties could determine what are the best next steps. Does this person, do they return the firearms after there's been a complete separation? Does the victim need time to move and relocate, get their kids in a new childcare or school? Or is the perpetrator going to move and go somewhere and give the victim time to, change information, et cetera? Are they going to go to treatment? Is it addiction treatment, mental health treatment? Is that what's necessary? Whatever the case. But it was a temporary gun relinquishment or firearm relinquishment bill, and it got one hearing, and there was just not a lot of, and then there was the red flag bill too, and one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle brought forth the red flag bill. Back then, that was Governor Kasich's idea, so he encouraged a Republican member to take that bill, so Rep. Haney did. And nothing happened. He didn't get any hearings, and then it was in my committee, and I watched the Buckeye Firearm Association go after him in ways I've never seen that community go after a member of the Republican caucus. And to the point where I was even uncomfortable that he was almost threatened in committee by members of the Buckeye Firearm Association who were there advocating against the red flag bill.
So we needed to give them an assessment.
I wanted to add to what she says. Shame on all of us. This is one place we really do need to make a difference. We know that guns kill domestic violence victims. Already we would be the 49th state if we adopted a strangulation bill. 38 states have firearms legislation in some fashion. But it's hard because one, we have to in some way codify federal law that says if you're convicted of a misdemeanor domestic violence or you're subject to a protection order, you can't have a weapon for the duration of either the protection order or forever if you're convicted of misdemeanor DV. But of course, the devil's in the details. And that means, how do we get them surrendered? Who's going to store them? Or do we confiscate them? Do the cops just come in? Can you get a warrant? And then, at least for the protection orders, when the protection order ends, how you get them returned. And it is so complicated. But at the very least, if we can codify federal law, we will be making progress. I know at Cuyahoga County Domestic Court, we already have policies on return and surrender of weapons.
And I just want to add, it's complicated, but there are states who've done it. And they have seen a decline in domestic violence, homicide from firearms, from the use of firearms. And it goes once again to stigma and attitude about victims. And the majority of victims are women. And I'm just saying this as a woman who, in the legislature who listens to the conversations, the right to bear arms versus a victim's right to survive. Those are conversations that we actually have.
So you said that people should be doing something about this. What type of advocacy do you think would get people's attention on this? Do you think it needs to be this kind of solutions-based, evidence-based advocacy? I mean, what do you think might bring that conversation to the point that it needs to be at? I'm sorry, that's a really hard question.
No, I mean, it's not hard. It's just that there's so many, again, it's like a continuum, right? So what kind of advocacy could impact gun policy and domestic violence policy, victim protection policy? We could put some people in this room to get to some signatures to put, campaign finance reform on the ballot. We could do redistricting again. We have to have balance in the legislature. That's part of the problem. We won't change the politics around gun possession, firearm possession, we won't change the policy until we change the politics. That's the best way for me to say it. And so when you see bills, certainly, I mean, I have every intent, once we get through Aishas Law, my goal is to have that bill passed by the anniversary of her demise, which was in November. So November 2020 is my goal to, at minimum, have it passed out of the House and into the Senate. Once we do that, my goal is to, around that time, resume the Domestic Violence Victim Protection Act, which is the temporary gun relinquishment bill. When you see that, please start calling and especially, certainly call our state senator and, the Cuyahoga County delegation, but also call the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, and urge them to pass this responsible gun legislation bill that protects victims of domestic violence. So look for opportunities for that. And at the federal level too. I mean, if they do it at the federal level, it's a bigger shot for us to, as Alexandria said, codify it at the state level so it's really enforceable.
So I always seem to be like the guy where the rubber hits the road, right? So we have, in situations, especially in the civil arena, in domestic relations court, when they are getting protection orders, they in fact can, once in a while, get the individuals to surrender their weapons. Well, guess what a new wrinkle was? They don't know what to do with those weapons. They're not going to give them to the Shaker Heights Police Department because they had nothing to do with the Shaker Heights Police Department. What do you do with these weapons? They used to be smelted in some of our steel mills, and they are now refusing to take those. So in my wonderful committee on the Domestic Violence Task Force, the head of the Firearms Surrender Committee happens to be with us, and she is advocating, and Bert Griffin, who is here, former Judge Griffin, has been doing work in this area. So locally, we are trying to take our little bitty steps that we can to, when those weapons come into our possession, know what to do with them and how to get rid of them. There is a criminal process, but there is not a civil process. Did I say that well?
You did.
Okay.
Thank you. So this question, I'm gonna have to interpret a little bit because I'm not sure exactly what it means. Is child abuse within the scope of this conversation? So I'm gonna go ahead and say yes. I'm not sure whether the intent of that is the abuse of children or children who are witnessing domestic violence and that being considered abuse. So we can talk about all of that.
So I'll just say that I had, originally in my bill, I had an automatic child endangerment charge if children were present when the law enforcement arrived at the scene. And the caution I received was not from, prosecutors or defense attorneys. It was from domestic violence victims advocates and from survivors. They said the risk of children being removed from the care of the victim, even after the victim gets safe, and put into the system is too great. Now that's the opposite direction that I'm trying to go. I got kinship care bills, foster care bills, I got more funding for child protection services in this budget, working with the governor. That's the opposite direction. I do not want to put more children in foster care or in kinship care. So what I've asked the she's newer, how long, 6 months, a year, the director of the Ohio Coalition of Domestic Violence Victims Programs, I've asked her to work with me to create a bipartisan task force on researching best practices in terms of policy on how to better protect children who are experiencing domestic violence via the adults in their lives. We don't do enough, but we have to do it responsibly. We cannot risk putting children in foster care. There are right now 16,000 plus children in foster care in the state of Ohio alone. That does not include the emergency foster care placements that happen on a daily basis because of things like overdosing and et cetera.
And that knowledge and experience, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, kind of comes out of working with children and family services and knowing that, often sometimes a victim would be charged with a crime or then have a call made to 696 Kids, and the positioning being you're not protecting this child, maybe not kind of looking at the whole picture of what was done and what could be done. So I think that's kind of where that experience comes from, and also not knowing who police might want charged with that offense. Is it the person that committed the offense or the person that was the victim of that offense? So that's definitely a complicating factor. One of the other questions we have here, and I've heard this a lot, this always comes up when I'm reporting on domestic violence, is whether therapy and programs can reduce the likelihood of a DV offender to abuse or no longer abuse a partner.
So I'll just hand this off right after this. I also, in the beginning, had in my bill that the task force that my bill creates would, or the domestic violence victims program at this point, they're both in there now, but originally it was just the high-risk team, that they would work with both getting the victim safe, but also connect the perpetrator to whatever needed programs there might be determined. So if it's treatment, like we mentioned earlier, mental health, addiction, or even workforce training. If the trigger was lost their job and started drinking and using and, being home too much, get them in workforce training development program. So again, I listened to I had several interested party meetings. Those are where you bring all sides of the bill that you're trying to create, the kind of policy you're trying to create, together to hear all of the, sort of devil advocate sort of stuff, as well as the, inform the bill. And again, the domestic violence victims programs were the ones to say there could be a conflict, having the same team work with both the victim and the perpetrator, so that should be done in a separate piece of legislation. So I'm also looking at things to do about interventions for perpetrators, but that would be very separate.
And the other piece is, if we're going to do something for batterers, we have to make certain that we have batterer standards.
Yes.
Because the programming is all over the place. Because domestic violence is not anger management.
That's right.
We are dealing with domestic violence and batterers treatment. And I know.
And if this lethality screening is administered, and it's determined that that situation is lethal, that batterer is not the person I'm looking at providing intervention for. I want to make sure that people understand that.
And so I think that's the deeper thing that folks want to understand, how do you look and how do you know and how do you understand the difference between something that happened that shouldn't have and something that is cyclical or chronic, because not every situation ever will be one that repeats itself. So, and I don't know that there's a list of things that can help you discern that. There's a list of things that can give you an idea, but maybe the first time you don't know that, right? So you know some more about.
Yeah, okay, I don't want to answer for too long. I think it's looking at intent, right? Domestic violence is not an anger management issue. It's not. What I tell victims, folks, all of the time is perpetrators are really good at managing their anger, right? Coming back to this person that I love, I care about, would never do these things because they're already managing their anger really well, right? They're not yelling at their boss, they're not yelling at their coworker, they're waiting until they're around this specific person to do these things. And so looking at kind of those one-offs or whatever, it's about power and control. And so often when it escalates to the point of physical violence, that's my job as an advocate, that's our job, to have those more in-depth conversations. Okay, but when's the last time you've seen your family? Oh, well, I'm not allowed to talk, I don't talk to my family anymore. Or, do you work? Oh, I'm not working. Do you know your neighbors? Oh no, he's the person that talks to the neighbors. And so it's really taking it a step deeper to that intent, right? We all get angry, we all get annoyed, we all get frustrated, but that doesn't mean that we then abuse our partners or our family members or our people that we care about, right? So it's coming back to that intent, and just, again, education and having those conversations. And sometimes, what I say when I'm out with folks, it's really awkward. It's really uncomfortable. But having those conversations about a deeper level can be so, so helpful. Okay, we're out hanging out and my partner does something, I'm so sorry that they acted this way. That's you all's opportunity to say, but Megen, they didn't yell at us, they yelled at you. Tell me more about that, right? And so again, it's digging a little deeper, right?
And speaking of education, I'm going to take an opportunity to tell you another thing that you can do that's not that hard. Years and years and years ago, there was a bill passed that hasn't maybe quite been enforced the way it could, that says that young folks in your school district and all the other school districts are supposed to get education on interpersonal violence, teen dating and violence. I watched that bill be advocated for, and the person that I know that advocated for it is heartbroken that all the school districts don't do this education now. But included in that legislation was a provision that said any parent of a child in the school district can request the curriculum. And if you can request the curriculum, you can see if it is a good curriculum and one that is giving young people the tools to recognize signs of violence, danger in relationship. Very simple action that if one parent in every school district in the county requested the curriculum, we could look at them all and see which ones are doing it right, which ones could use improvement, what are the issues with that, is it funding, is it, not having the right tools to train the teachers to teach it. So very simple thing that would have a huge impact to make sure that students are getting the right education in middle school and high school.
And if I might comment on that, so the folks here in Shaker Heights had the misfortune of several years ago a stalker taking the life of Penny Chang. And as a result, we went into the schools, into the high school and the junior high school, and they very quickly enveloped a curriculum, it was fabulous, of trying to tell these youths who are obviously immature because they're young, but what the difference is between someone trying to control you with a cell phone and flattering you with the cell phone and their contacts back and forth. So, and they had, at that point in time, woven that into their health curriculum. Similarly, Alexandria was on a task force with me over at John Carroll, and part of that was, and Janine can probably tell you this, that throughout the United States, many times there are now programs coming into college when the football players come in August about appropriate dating. You know, yes means yes. Forget no, let's do it yes. So I don't want to get off the topic of control in the domestic violence situation, but you are correct. We need to keep looking for that education and making sure that our young people don't get sucked into that controlling relationship and get pulled into that isolationism and that feeling of helplessness.
And it needs to happen earlier, from everything I can tell and everything I've read. You know, we talk to preschoolers about some stranger approaching them or a relative touching them, and it's not okay, and how do you learn a good touch and bad touch? And there's ways earlier to incorporate for children seeing something that doesn't make sense, or if someone says something that's hurting their feelings, how they can react and who they can talk to. One of the things that I've learned from working with teenagers is, yes, they're probably not going to come and tell me that this is happening, but they are going to tell their friends, and if their friends know what to do, it will get to the right person, and they'll be more likely to get help because they all know what's happening with everybody. So we're getting kind of close to the end. I just definitely wanted to do a plug for the library. There are some cards. I have one here. I think I have another one up here that has some additional reading and information that they put together on domestic violence, and also information on some additional programming that'll happen throughout the year. So, you know, the library is always a place it's community-based, responsive to the community. I think this forum is actually happening in part because of the community asked for it to happen. So if you want to learn more, I'm sure we can find some more of these for you guys to take with you, and you can check out a book before you go home. And I really appreciate the library for having this here too. So we're kind of, I think we're getting kicked out in 5 minutes. Nicely kicked out. It would be great, you know, we've had such a good conversation here. We could probably, especially this group, talk about this for about 5 more hours. I know I'm learning new things and re-remembering things that I've reported on before that I need to follow up on. And I think one of the things we can take away is that just this awareness and community pressure can be such a game changer when it comes to this progress. And progress on this topic does not happen in giant leaps. It happens in steps. And then you have to keep on things to make sure that what's been put in place is working. And that's the harder part. That's the more exhausting and maybe less fun part. It's really cool to like make a law, but then following it up for the next decade to make sure it works, not as fun. I mean, it's kind of fun to debate people, right? It's okay.
I mean, you know.
If you, I guess that's just me. If you guys could each suggest maybe 1 or 2 things you think that just about anybody could do to get engaged or amplify some of this work that's getting done, if we could kind of run through that. Let's have an idea for everybody. The person that wants to personally do work with folks, and someone who's like, I'll write letters and make phone calls, but I don't really want to talk to people. All kinds of stuff like that would be good advice to have.
So I think just kind of the same thing I keep saying, talk with your neighbors. If you have teenagers, the thing, whenever I'm anywhere, I'm at a high school, I'm at a college, use us as an excuse. Hey, I went to this thing, there's some things they said, how do you feel about this? It's very easy, it's very low key. We were here, you can use that to start conversations. Yeah, just use us, that's why we're here, right?
I would say that I worry about those families. None of us have come from perfect homes and perfect experiences. And I think that as we look, I look even at my own children and realize the shortcomings they might have in handling difficult relationships, not coming from the perfect TV show of a home. To educate our children as well as ourselves on how to deal with difficult issues in a civil and respectful way when we are behind those closed doors is just of utmost importance in a one-on-one. And then before I pass my mic, there is a resource we have in this county that we haven't talked about, and that's the Family Justice Center. And that is downtown. It's basically the corner of St. Clair and 13th Street, I think. And in that, the goal, and it's a fabulous facility, was rather than run victims to 27 places with buses and little children after them and their perps looking to control them some more, if they could put these resources in one place. And that Family Justice Center is growing leaps and bounds, but it is a fabulous resource.
Be there for them. And I will tell you why. It takes a victim of domestic violence 7 to 10 times to get out of a battering situation. If you are that support system, don't turn them away when they go back. Be there time and time again, because at some point they will get out. And I've made that my practice with what I do. Clients will come, we'll go through all the process, we'll do the paperwork, and then they'll stop. And then they'll come back. And if they know you're there, it may help them this time. This may be that time to get out.
What I've been asking people to do, specifically to Aishas Law, but you can do this just in general, is to advocate to at the federal level, to the Office of Violence Against Women, and request that they create funding, matching funds, grants for states like in Ohio that's implementing a lethality protocol, states who are interested in doing gun relinquishment, firearm relinquishment in domestic violence cases, ask them to, advocate to the Office of Violence Against Women, advocate to our congressperson, our senators, and ask them to please urge the Office of Violence Against Women to create funding opportunities for states that are implementing protocols that are aggressive in the way they protect victims of violence. And you can do that by email, phone, all that. Sorry.
And I should have talked about this earlier. I'm trying not to have my back to you guys. As many of you know, Cleveland has the bond reform part of what's being pushed by our claim dealer in place now. And so we have a pretrial services program that is in effect. But one of the things for me as a jurist that's concerning is this push to let everybody out of jail. Some people don't need to be out. It might take them a week to be able to move and to be safe. And so we have to look at what's best for the community and not just, oh my goodness, I can't believe you're keeping that person in jail. It's not about keeping them in jail. It's not about that he won't get out someday. It's about, A, holding him responsible. I'm saying him because it's more likely him than not. Him or her, there have been females, responsible for their behavior like any of us would be. And the second piece is giving that victim a chance to be able to see, one, that the justice system cares about what happened to her, as the young lady said to her, and two, a chance to make a decision about where she's going to be. She needs a day or two to figure out, oh my goodness, what just happened. So let's look at that realistically, and let's hold the community responsible like you would hold any other person responsible. What I say when I'm doing seminars, if somebody walked up, I love talking to young people, if somebody walked up to you and punched you in the face, nobody in here would say, oh my goodness, put them in jail. But the minute it becomes a husband or wife, then suddenly we're going, wait a minute, what if he loses his job? You wouldn't care if he lost his job if he punched you. So let's look at holding people responsible in that regard like you do in any other regard. And I'm in the phone book.
That's good. That's a good point about pendulums that can swing too far one way or another, and you have to be practical in how you think about how policy works.
And I want to add one more thing. You all don't have to have all the answers, right? We have a 24-hour helpline. I don't know how to handle that neighbor incident. Call that helpline. Give that helpline number slip it under their door, put it in their mailbox, right? 391-HELP. 391-4357. Call and talk to someone.
It's written on cards in the back of the room in case you're like me and you're like, I still won't remember 321 or 123 or whatever. It's right in the back of the room. And there's also folks sitting at the table back there. So if there's like a specific question that you didn't want to ask to a panel or whatever, they can answer that. They can tell you resources. They can tell you how you could get involved with the Domestic Violence and Child Advocacy Center. And as we close, before we really do get kicked out, I just wanted to give a big shout out to Legal Women Voters for putting this on, for having this conversation, for registering people back there. This is where the work gets done.